Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our international perspectives on the role of championing space. I'm really delighted and honored to be with you this afternoon, not least of which because today, of course, is an incredibly auspicious day. 66 years ago, the industry, the sector that we all love, the space age came into being with the launch on the 4th of October 1957 of the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1. Now, of course, that was put forward and proposed and driven by geopolitical imperatives. And I think even the engineers who designed Sputnik 1 would have had no idea that the space capabilities that they launched effectively would go on to transform the world. Not just the world of astronomy, looking out into space, not just the world of exploration, going into space with our robotic and our human systems, but arguably most importantly, with the world of satellites whose primary focus is not looking outwards, but looking inwards. Satellite applications. Space for the benefit of life on Earth, which has made the global village become a reality and which has become fundamental to our 21st century societal infrastructure in so many ways. Now, what we have achieved as a species and as societies around the world using our space capabilities is absolutely incredible. But if we want to maintain that momentum going forwards, then the role of championing space could not be more important. And so, exploring what we mean by championing space from an individual and from an institutional point of view is one of the themes of today. We will have an opportunity to hear from leaders in their field. We will have an opportunity for you to present your questions, and so you can put your questions forward on Slido, which I will take in the last part of the session. But what I hope you take away at the end of this session is not only the imperative for championing space, for explaining to wider stakeholders, policymakers, governments, budget holders, wider research and academia, why we do what we do and why it's so important, but also I hope you'll take away an enhanced sense of what you can do within whichever part of the space ecosystem you are representing here at IAC and in your wider lives. So I hope that sets the context, and I'm really delighted and honored to be welcoming our three panelists. Rather than me introduce them, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but in the form of a homework question, which they're now going to answer. And the homework question is what does championing space mean to your organization, but also to you personally? So over to the panelists. Agnieszka.
Thank you very much. My name is Agnieszka Łukaszczyk. I'm a Vice President for Government Affairs at Planet, covering Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I'm very excited to be at this panel because I think it's we're talking about important things here. I didn't come originally, my entire career has been in the space sector, but when I studied, I thought space was weird. I didn't really think about space. This was not really something that I wanted to do in life. Somehow it worked out that I got my first internship in the space sector, and I realized the kind of impact it has on life. So my motivation was always about being involved in the sector that has a global impact, and I truly believe space has that sort of ability. We're just not very good at letting the general public know about it. We are used to preaching to the choir and speaking to each other, but we don't necessarily get out there and explain to people what we really have to offer. I don't know why, but I often get into these conversations with Uber drivers. Sometimes when we're stuck in traffic, they're trying to strike the conversation. They're like, oh, what do you do? and I say, you know, I work in the space sector, and I was like, wow, what do you like, catching aliens? And this is, you know, waste of money we're spending. There's so many problems here on Earth, and then we get into the conversation that actually what we're doing has a direct impact on life on Earth. So, so that's kind of the, you know, the motivation for me, and this is why I'm still at this sector, because I truly and genuinely believe that we have a huge potential and a big impact. And my job has always been focused on looking from up there down instead of from here up. So it was always focused on the impact here on Earth, and I think we need to do a little better job of communicating this to a larger society.
Thanks very much. I was very glad you picked those examples. Well, number one, you picked it for looking outside our space bubble, but also so when you're talking with the taxi drivers. But secondly, I think quite often in life, when you take something for granted, it's because you absolutely depend on it. And it was that area of satellite applications that I think, even within the space sector, you know, many of us on the astronomy or exploration side may have no real awareness of. And so thank you for putting that together so concisely and so powerfully. To our next panelist, I'm delighted to introduce Arti. But Arti, you can tell us more about your role and your vision of what championing space means to you personally and to your organization.
Thank you, Anu. Delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm the brand new since 2 weeks, Director of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. When I'm asked about championing space, my mind immediately goes back to 2006 and in fact to the UK. The UK did something called Case for Space, where they articulated so clearly what tangible benefits space technology, data and services brought to the UK economy. By doing this, the UK doubled its investment into the European Space Agency, and it led to the setting up into the European Space Agency, and it led to the establishment of the UK Space Agency as well. And since then, you've been reaping the benefits of that investment. From the UN perspective, I see the Office for Outer Space Affairs as the custodians of space for the SDGs. That means for me that we have the responsibility of making sure that UN member states really benefit from the benefits of space technology, data, and applications. Space, data, and services have the potential to move the needle on so many global issues which are key priorities for governments at this time. Whether it's universal primary education, whether it's climate change, social inclusion, disaster management, or even driving more efficient transport services and reducing carbon emissions, for example, from aviation. The list goes on and on. Making sure space is actually doing that and that member states understand that is what drives me, and that is the energy and the inspiration that I want to convey through the office and motivate member states to really make a renewed effort to engage in the multilateral process and also with the office so that we can do our job better. How do we do it? Well, we have partnerships with space agencies, with industry, with civil society. Across the world, we run 20 different programs, and in doing them, we contribute to the achievement of 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We champion the application of space in front of the other UN organizations as well, through something called UN Space. I think this is really important, and Agnieszka, we haven't had the time for a bilateral, so I'm going to say it here on stage, but when I came into this job, I asked the office, I hope we're going to COP. Knowing it's a no-brainer, the pivotal role that space tech plays for climate change. And the office said, no, you know, there are other UN agencies who lead that. It's UNEP, it's UNCC. We don't usually go. And I said, okay, please change that. So now we are going to speak. I'm sure there's plenty of space representation going to be there. Well, we need to work harder to make sure that we are not just a sidelined agency in the wings, but we are front and central on this issue. So let's collaborate on that. It's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. We also have scientific and technical projects that allow member states to develop their own capabilities. I think perhaps the most well-known one is KiboCube. It's a partnership with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and it allows developing countries to launch their own satellites and to really kickstart their own space economies. And when we do that, we accompany that process through capacity building, helping those countries who are launching their very first satellite put in place robust regulation, perhaps implement their first space law, and so on. And I think this is laying the fundament for space sustainability from the roots up. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Ardin. And you made very clear, and I know it's the UN's overarching focus, but that focus on Sustainable Development Goals, space for the benefit of life on Earth and for all of the member states of the United Nations, so effectively all of humanity, is really nice to see as a North Star that you are driving towards. And now I'm delighted to introduce our final panelist, Dr. Megan Christian, who is one of my colleagues at the United Kingdom Space Agency, but has a far more interesting and exciting job than I have at the moment. So, Megan, over to you.
I think you have a pretty exciting job too. My name's Megan Christian. So my background is actually as a materials science researcher. So I've spent about 9 years at the National Research Council of Italy developing advanced materials for alternative energy. During that time, I also spent a year in Antarctica. And I think this is probably, it's not the first time I started championing science. I did some of that for my alternative energy research, but being there in Antarctica, spending a year doing climate change research was a really privileged position to get that word out there. So while I was there, the team and I, we did about 70 or 80 video conferences with schools, with public events, with many, many different people around the world, just to explain the kind of research that we were doing. And so my time in Antarctica led into then applying to become an astronaut with the European Space Agency. I think it was really my time there that made me realize that, yes, this is something that I can do. Beforehand, I might not have thought that I had the skills to do this, but it built my confidence. And so then I did apply. Got through this extremely long process. There were 22,500 applications. So I was amazed every time I got through to the next step. But then finally, in November last year, I was the class of 17 was announced, and I was one of the reserves. So a little bit disappointed to not be going and doing my training right away, but also, very happy to be in this position. And this is a new privileged position where I can talk about space, and this is where championing space comes in. And it is such an important part of my role. So for me, it's about getting the word out there. A lot to school children. Above all, this is most of the work that I do. I go to schools or I go to events. But at the UK Space Agency, we take a kind of holistic approach to championing space. There's the education part, so we kind of foster space from when children are very young to when they're in high school choosing their subjects, then when they're in university, internships, then when they start their career, helping them to get jobs in the space sector, and also people who are changing from a different sector across to the space sector, which is what I did. So I think that's a really important thing as well. There are a kind of lack of skills. There are many, many jobs out there, but not necessarily as many people to fill the roles who have the right kind of skills. So we have this really holistic approach across the whole generation. At the same time, of course, it's really important. One of our main roles is to catalyze investment in the UK. So that means speaking to stakeholders as well. It means driving policy. It means talking to government. So as a government agency ourselves, we also then have to convince ministers to fund our programs. So, it's absolutely fundamental to what we do.
No, thanks very much, McGann. I mean, you've actually summarized it perfectly and brought together two separate strands in terms of the sort of commercial world perspectives, in terms of policy perspectives, and then talking about what we do in the UK. Because at some stage, for anybody who's still not thinking about the importance of this and the challenge, at some stage in your careers, if you are progressing through, you'll be asking a non-space person or possibly a non-scientist for money. And therefore, you've got to get all of those sort of arguments into place. Talking about what the UK Space Agency's perspective is. So, I've got quite a long title that's up there, but the shortened version is Director of Championing Space. Because in the UK Space Agency, we have three fundamental pathways around which we do everything. The first of those is catalyzing investment. The second one is delivering our missions and capabilities. And the third one is championing space at the top strategic level of the agency. Now, in my case, the teams that I'm privileged to lead, international policy, our European Space Agency team, our skills and future workforce teams, because if we want to sustain our sector, it is about that next generation coming in, as well as people who are going to come into our sector as well. The communications and the engagement with policymakers, with the media, with the general public is absolutely a key enabler. And then finally, parliamentary and public affairs, so really focusing on ministers. But from me as a personal perspective, why this is so important, and one of the reasons why I came into the agency relatively recently, but having spent a long time in space, people from the United Kingdom may be familiar with this, that a few years ago, His Royal Highness Prince William was asking the question, with all of the environmental and societal challenges we have here on Earth, why are we bothering with space stuff? Now, many of us in the sector took real offense at this. Of course, more than half of the climate change variables can only be measured from space, and we know the economic figures. But my personal perspective was, what Prince William thought was a valid question, because we collectively as a sector had failed in our task of communicating to that diverse bunch of stakeholders. And so, championing space is no longer a nice to have, it is a must have. But talking about challenges, what I now want to do is to move to a round of individualized questions. And I'm going to start with you, McGann. So in your role with UK Space Agency, but also as an ESA reserve astronaut, being an astronaut, it's the trope, it's the draw for so many people, but we know space is much more than that. So how do you use that sort of platforming of being a reserve astronaut to highlight what championing space is all about? And thus far, what have you seen as the opportunities, but also the challenges that we need to face?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's a really interesting position to be in. So if you have astronaut in your title, everybody assumes you know everything about space. So I would say that would be one of the challenges. I get put on panels to talk about things, and I spend my time studying, and I actually love it. So I love learning more and more about the whole space sector, and I think like I was talking about before, having that privileged position, I think it's something that I definitely have to do. Like, I feel that it's necessary to be a role model, to champion space. And so I think it's definitely a position that is absolutely necessary. I can't just ignore that part of being an astronaut. So it's absolutely fundamental. And I'm learning interesting things all the time. So I was at a conference last week in Belfast for Science and Discovery Centres, and they presented a study about how society sees R&D, research and development. And people were saying, yeah, that's great, but I think we should be solving the world's problems before we invest in R&D. And as a researcher myself, I thought, well, what have I been doing? I mean, as a researcher, that's exactly what we do. We try to solve the world's problems, and we get the same question, and then in specifically in the space sector. So that's great, going to space, it's really inspirational and all, but why don't we solve the problems we have here on Earth, just like you were saying, Anu? Why don't we solve the problems we have here on Earth before we go to space? And I'm like, well, we are going to space to solve the problems that we have here on Earth. So I think I have an opportunity, having the platform that I have, to raise that awareness and that understanding in the general community, but really across. This isn't limited to young people. It's not limited to the general public, but also people in very high positions don't necessarily have this understanding. So I feel that I have a platform to help them understand.
That's great. Thanks very much, Megan. Agnieszka, I want to come to you next because you've had a very varied career with different organizations within the space sector. And I wonder if you could share with us, and you can anonymize them or you can, you can call them out. It's entirely up to you. I'd be really interesting to know from those organizations, you know, how did they embrace championing space? What did it mean to them? Were they successes? Were there failures? And you know, what was your take within your career as it progressed in terms of how those organizations were tackling or not this issue?
Yeah, I mean, because my motivation was to be part of a sector that has an impact, I was always looking for places where that really were trying to have that impact in the real way. And so my career has been through, started in an NGO and then went to a public sector, and now I'm in an industry, which is great because it gives you an overview of what different entities are doing and where you can play a best role. I will focus on the last two because I think those are the most relevant. So I was working in the European Commission on the Copernicus program, and I mean, their mandate is very clear. It is taxpayers' money. I mean, I'm sure you know how that works. So they had a huge focus on what they called user and market uptake to make sure that actually those tools that the Commission is developing are actually being used by various governments, by regions, and that was really important for them. And then I never really thought about going to industry because I thought industry was just about hardware and making profits. But then there's this little company called Planet, and it turns out that they actually do have a mission, and that mission is to help life on Earth, and that is really what we genuinely at Planet believe. So we are listed on the New York Stock Exchange as a public benefit corporation, and this is a very strange animal. I'm not sure if everybody knows how that works. There's literally only I think 12 companies in the world that did that, because it's a very difficult setup where you are responsible legally not just towards your shareholders to deliver profits, but you're responsible to stick to your mission. So you have to sometimes make difficult business decisions where you could have a business opportunity very lucrative, but if it goes against your mission, you're legally obliged to turn it down. And so we have ethics committee, and we take that very seriously because we really believe that our data should have a positive impact on Earth. So pretty much everything that we do is, we actually, like if you talk to our co-founders, they often say that we're not a space company. Like the satellites are just a tool. We're really a data company or a platform company. We really trying to offer solutions and answers to various questions and problems that the world is dealing with today. And I think that what a little bit sets us apart. And when we for instance, go to a lot of events like what Arti was mentioning, COP. We've been going COP for so long because these people that go there, they make very important decisions. But we truly believe at Planet that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So the decision makers, they need this sort of data to make informative decisions. But they don't really often know that this data, this information is available. So we go actually to events and to conferences that are, agri-conferences, forestry, climate, not just, because space conferences are fun and it's good to interact, but we really are just preaching to a choir here, right? Nobody here needs convincing. We need to really step outside of our box and talk to people that could actually utilize what we have to offer. So at Planet, we do that a lot. It's extremely important to us. Arti also mentioned Sustainable Development Goals. We've assessed that 13 out of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be helped with by Earth observation alone. So it's huge. We can really have a true impact on the world. And our CEO, Will Marshall, often says that if he's saying this to startups and young entrepreneurs. If you want to start a business, don't just start it for the sake of technology or just to be a business person. Like, try to look at those SDGs and and see if your business can help any of those. Because you can be humanitarian and a business person at the same time. You don't have to choose. You can make money and feel good about yourself at the same time. And I think this is what we're trying to do at Planet.
No, that's fantastic. And in your answer, you brought together a couple of other themes that I think personally are manifesting themselves in a profound societal change in terms of expectations. And they're about sustainability and environmental protection and the way that businesses work. And allied to that, environmental and societal and governance frameworks, ESG frameworks, and it's clearly highlighted by what you're talking about there. So thank you. Arti, so having had a long-standing career in the satellite industry, but as the new UNUSA director, you are looking and setting your vision for the future. So looking at the challenge landscape for championing space, be it with individual nations, and obviously not naming them, but in regions and internationally, globally, what is that challenge space looking like for you? And what are your initial thoughts you might share with us? Nascent thoughts on how you're going to address that, because they are profound.
My initial reaction is there's three big things here. One is the obvious, which is resources and the disconnect between policy, the need for solutions and the response to actually bridging the gap to delivering them. The second is storytelling and perception about the industry. And the third one is how we talk about space and the fact that we're always speaking to each other and not enough outside. But before I get into it, can I just ask the audience, how many people can confidently say that you know what USA is and what it does? Can you raise your hands? That's kind of normal. But let's come back in a year, and when I ask that question again, I hope that everybody raises their hand and that the room will be full. I have to say, when I got this job, so many of my friends said, what is that office? They couldn't even believe that it existed. And so that's where it starts. That's the first challenge. Even though we are making such a fundamental contribution, it's not trivial to be helping countries launch their first satellite or put a space law into place. That's not trivial at all. But if we're going to impact the SDGs at scale, then we have to make sure that the work of the Office of the Committee of the Peaceful Uses on Outer Space, of all of us, of this sector as a whole, is really put on the map in front of governments, in front of the international community at large, not just the international space community, and UN agencies and policymakers. Here I'd make the point that the Secretary General of the United Nations has recognized space. He gets it that space is now a thing. For whatever reason, people may know that space is a thing because they understand our relevance to the SDGs. It's more likely that the layman knows it because of a few rich men who have done some things and put it on the map. But the thing is, for governments, it's, as you said, Megan, the conveying the message that we actually help solve everyday challenges. That's the big thing. Governments have competing priorities. They have to justify how they spend their taxpayers' money. And if it's not obvious, then I'm not sure that they are willing to take the time to learn why and make the effort to communicate why to the electorate and to their stakeholders. We have to start doing that. We are the ambassadors of that, and we have to infect policymakers with that energy and touch them so that they start doing the same. I wonder, we wouldn't even know there was a climate crisis if we weren't seeing it from space. I wonder, would people actually believe that we landed on the moon if it hadn't have been broadcast by satellite? Or would people be saying, fake news, that's propaganda that one country is claiming they landed on the moon. So we have been enabling this storytelling for years. But we haven't been saying it's from space. You know, when we grew up, we used to see on BBC News live via satellite. Now you just see live. And it's still, more often than not, via satellite. But nobody says that anymore, right? And the stories are very impactful. I come from the SATCOM sector. The members of this association where I worked, they were taking isolated communities with zero connectivity to having 4G connectivity within a matter of 2 months. Another member is connecting 250 schools with marginalized girls across remote Kenya. And by giving those kids access to 1 hour online per week, they measured that the learning age was increasing by 1.5 years in just 1 year. So the stories are profound. They do have the power to touch people and to inspire them. Whether you care about space or not, if we share some of these stories, it's like watching a good movie. People want to know more. They want to hear more. They want to listen more. So up to us to really step outside our space bubble and start conveying that. And I'm conscious, you as a reserve astronaut from the material science world, Aga, with all of your experience and now working for effectively a climate change agent company, me as an ambassador with the UN and you in your role, there's such a responsibility on us. It's not just us doing jobs that we enjoy and moving forward in our career. We have been entrusted with a responsibility to go out and provoke and invoke change, and we have to do that.
That's a fantastic final summary there, and it also reminds us that we're here on stage and we might be platform catalysts, but ultimately it is going to be down to members of our community to do the real hard work. And talking to the members of our community in our audience, I'm delighted that we have some questions that have come forward. So we've got about 9 minutes left, and I'll see if I can get through all of them. So if I can ask for maybe one person, whoever's going to be first on the panel, to shoot their hand up in answer to the question. So they're all anonymous. The first one is, how do you react to detractors, and what's the right strategy for you? So who's going to be the first to step into... Megan, your hand has shot straight up. So detractors, how and what's right for you?
Yeah, I do get some very strange sort of comments now and then, and some of them are, from flat earthers, this kind of thing. But some of them are very legitimate concerns that people have, or beliefs that they have. For example, what we were talking about, like why are we going to space when we could be solving the problems here on Earth? And it's a matter of just setting the record straight, but it's really a matter of judging your audience. So some people want to hear about the exploration, about learning the fundamental secrets of our universe, but that's just not going to fly with everybody. There are other people, if they're worried about being homeless tomorrow, what they want to hear is that the space sector is bringing in money to the country, which can then be used, if used properly, to solve those problems as well. And they want to know about the technologies that could then that are being developed for the space industry that can then help them in their daily lives. So it's really a matter of judging that audience and deciding accordingly, because we have the answers to a lot of these things. They're just not well known.
Thanks very much, Megan. The next question, so I'll leave it to between Arti and Agnieszka to shoot their hands up first if they want to answer this one, although no, I'll just read the question. There seems to be growing disenchantment with space where the ultra-rich gets involved. So it actually ties in with the point that you made earlier, Arti. How can a global voice exist above that of Elon Musk's or Jeff Bezos's? So who wants to answer that one? Agnieszka.
Thank you, Arti. This is a valid question. And people often ask, why do these people do it? Do they do it just for their own prestige and for getting visibility? Was launching a car into space a really smart or useful thing to do? Probably not. It was, one big piece of debris, let's be honest. At the same time, I'm just always trying to go back to the pragmatics. you know. So I always tell people, just imagine we would turn off all the satellites for 24 hours. What would happen? You know, and then you list the things that would happen. That you know, the banks would stop working. People don't even think about it. You know, that they're actually coordinated by the atomic clocks on GNSS satellites. That shipping would stop, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there are all of these things. So I was like, you cannot judge all the benefits by the actions of one or two. At the same time, though, I do have to say that if it wasn't for rich people's money, and I'm not talking about one particular person or two, but rich people's money, probably companies like Planet and others would not exist, because Planet was born out of venture capital. So that means a lot of rich people invested in the company. And this is what helped us to accelerate very fast. So unfortunately, this is a very expensive business, and it needs funds and it needs money, but it needs people with a vision. So I also sometimes, you know, because you often have you hear these conspiracy theories that you've heard also around COVID. So clearly, if somebody has money and is doing something big, it's very suspicious. Mm-hmm. And I would not want to make that assumptions about everything. Some people do have a genuine goal to actually use their money into something good. When you look at for instance, a CEO or co-founders, I mean, those people who know them, I mean, they have holes in their shoes, and we need to dress them up when we take them public places, because they probably look like somebody would want to give them money. So they're not there for profits. They're there really, you know, to make an impact. So it is a difficult question. And I think this is a valid argument, because we are often collateral damage because of the actions of the few, but we need to look at a bigger picture.
Okay, I've got one more question from the audience, and then I'll have a final question for each of you that will be quick fire. The final question from the audience: numbers are key when talking about the cost of space and its benefits. What are your favorite figures to use when you're speaking to non-space orientated stakeholders? So, have any of you got, Arti, your hand just absolutely shot up there?
Because I've learnt one in the last few days, and that is that 26 of the 54 climate variables can only be measured by space. Only be measured by space. This goes back to this point about we wouldn't even know there was a crisis unless we saw it from space. Generally, I have two views on the numbers. On the one hand, as a sector, we are very bad at collecting data about our impact. That's one thing. And on the other hand, we have a tendency to estimate numbers in so many different ways that nobody trusts the numbers that are out there. So there's probably something we need to look at.
No, that's a very, very powerful point, in that, you know, all of the elements of championing space, they are absolutely strategically seminal force multipliers for us that we need to be using, but we need to be very careful that sometimes in building our cases we are not conflating one economic analysis with another, which sometimes, and I've seen it in my academic career, people are all too guilty of. So we're down to the last 2.5 minutes, so I'm going to ask for 30 seconds each. 1 point from each of you. So I'm going to start with Megan. What would you like the audience to have as one priority for what they can do in terms of championing space?
So Tim Peake's Principia mission, many years ago now, brought like a lot of engagement from children. Millions of children got engagement from this. And we learnt a lot, but we still need to learn, because the mind of the youth of today is changing. They're so much more worried about climate change, about their situations at home. So the message that we need to deliver around space is a holistic message. It's not just about that really easily understandable one of an astronaut going to space, because they'll go, well, why are we spending money on sending an astronaut to space? We really need to get across the message of the other benefits.
Thanks very much. Arti?
My one message would be, don't talk about the space race. That is a negative. Remember that each and every one of us who is involved in some way in the space sector is an ambassador for this sector. We all share the responsibility. You don't have to be a reserve astronaut, an executive vice president, a director, or a director of a UN agency to be an ambassador. We are all ambassadors. Find the one story that you may have heard about space technology, data, or services. For me, it's the schools in Africa. Tell that story again and again to people you meet. Just if every one of us took one story and told it again and again, I'm sure we could change perceptions and get more and more people behind this.
Thank you very much. And finally, Agnieszka.
Yeah, I think storytelling is the key. I mean, we have real stories to tell, and I don't think we cannot assume that people know what we do, and we cannot assume that people understand why it's important. So we have to have a story that is really relatable to other people. So real examples, and get out there. You know, step outside of your box. Go to events and activities that are not space related, and talk about what your job, how your job is relevant and how it can be impactful. What I also do, but this is just kind of going back to the kids, but I just do it out of the pleasure, that I actually go to, on my own time, to local schools from time to time. I went to my high school and my elementary school, and I talk to kids and I bring some swag. Everybody loves swag, and of course, obviously, if I go to elementary school, they don't care about planet. They don't ask me about my company. They care about how you pee in space. But it gets them excited, and it's just kind of make them familiar with that topic, and because that enthusiasm dies out later on, and we want to make sure that we keep the fire going.
Thanks very much, Agnieszka. And for all of the panelists, I mean, that's a real clarion call for action. I'd like to thank you all for your time, because you've set a real challenge, not just for the future, but for every member of this audience, for every person in this sector. And I think you put it perfectly, Agnieszka, because I think what unites us here, which is not the case in every sector, is that fundamentally we have people in this sector, no matter which part they're working with, who've still got a fire, a passion burning in their bellies. And what we need to do is tap into that and not be afraid of telling those stories. So I very much hope that members of the audience have found this panel useful, illuminating. You've heard a clear message. So would you like to now join me in giving a round of applause to all our panelists? Thank you very much. It was a really, really transformative session.